In the fading light of a forgotten railway station, two souls cast aside by the world found each other in the most unlikely way. Rosalie Kemp stepped off that eastbound train, carrying more than just her unborn child. She carried the weight of awe, desperation, and the fierce determination of a woman with nothing left to lose. On that same weathered bench sat Augustus Wilder, a cowboy whose legendary days were behind him, dismissed by younger men as too old, too slow, too broken to matter anymore. When she heard them mock him, something awakened in Rosalie's heart. Within hours of meeting, these two strangers made a decision that would shock the entire town of Jubilee Gap. But what started as a marriage of pure necessity soon became something neither of them expected. Could two people who had lost everything find salvation in each other? Or would the harsh realities of frontier life tear apart their fragile new beginning? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust from the eastbound locomotive still hung in the evening air when Rosalie Kemp set her worn carpetbag down beside the railway bench and truly looked at the man she'd just agreed to marry. Augustus Wilder sat with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to accommodate an aging body's protests, his silver hair catching the amber light of the station's oil lamps. His hands, weathered and scarred from decades of hard work, rested quietly on his knees, and when he turned those pale blue eyes toward her, she saw something that made her breath catch, not pity for her condition, not calculation about what he might gain, but a deep, abiding kindness that seemed to reach right through to her bones. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice carried the gravelly warmth of a man who'd spent years calling orders across open ranges. "I reckon we ought to get properly acquainted before we make this thing official. Name's Augustus Wilder, though most folks who remember me at all call me Gus. Been 63 years on this earth, and I'll tell you straight my best days are likely behind me." Rosalie smoothed her traveling dress over her rounded belly and settled beside him on the bench. The wood was smooth from countless travelers who'd waited here before them, worn smooth by hopes and disappointments, arrivals and departures. "Rosalie Kemp," she replied, then caught herself. "Soon to be Rosalie Wilder, I suppose. 28 years, and carrying my first child." She paused, studying his weathered face. "You say your best days are behind you, Mr. Wilder, but I'm thinking maybe you just haven't found the right reason to let them shine again." The old cowboy's eyes crinkled at the corners, and she glimpsed the man he must have been in his prime. "Hell's wind," he murmured, almost to himself. "That's what they used to call me, back when I could ride anything with 4 legs and had reflexes quick enough to outdraw men half my age. Seems like a lifetime ago now." "Hell's wind," Rosalie repeated, tasting the name. "Sounds like a man who knew how to make his mark on the world. Made my mark, all right. Problem is, marks fade, and men forget." Gus shifted slightly, and she caught the small wince that crossed his features. "These old bones don't bend like they used to, and my eyes, well, they're not what they were. Doc in Amarillo told me last spring that the clouding would only get worse. Sighed I might have a few good years of sight left, maybe less." The honesty of it struck her like a physical blow. Here was a man telling her his limitations before they'd even shaken hands properly, laying out his vulnerabilities like cards on a table. It was more courtesy than her late husband had ever shown her, more consideration than she'd received from most people in her 28 years. "My husband died 6 months ago," she said, matching his frankness. "Consumption took him slow, and he spent what little money we had on medicine that didn't help. Left me with debts I couldn't pay, and this." She pulled a folded letter from her carpetbag, the paper soft with handling. "His brother wrote from Colorado Territory, said there's land out there, a homestead that belonged to family. Says if I can get myself there and prove it up, it's mine free and clear." Gus took the letter when she offered it, holding it close to catch the lamplight. His lips moved slightly as he read, and she realized he was working harder than he wanted to let on to make out the words. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back. "Colorado Territory's rough country," he said. "Beautiful, but hard on folks who aren't prepared for it. You got experience with farming? Raising livestock? None to speak of, Rosalie admitted. But I can learn, and I can work. I've been working since I was 12 in other people's houses, in other people's kitchens, tending other people's children. Time I had something of my own to tend. And you figure a half-blind old cowboy might be useful for that? She turned to face him fully, and he was struck by the fire in her dark eyes. Mr. Wilder, I figure a man who lived long enough to earn a name like Hell's Wind probably knows things about surviving in hard country that I can't even imagine. And I figure a woman desperate enough to propose marriage to a stranger might have. The kind of determination that could make up for a lot of what we both lack. The station master, a thin man with tobacco-stained whiskers, approached them with obvious reluctance. Train's pulling out in 10 minutes, he announced. You folks need to make up your minds about what you're doing. We need a preacher, Rosalie said without hesitation. Someone who can marry us proper, with witnesses and papers and all. The station master's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. Ma'am, I don't know if you've thought this through. I've thought it through plenty. She cut him off. Mr. Wilder, are you having second thoughts? Gus pushed himself to his feet with deliberate care, and despite his age and limitations, there was something impressive about his full height, something that spoke of the commanding presence he must have possessed in his prime. Ma'am, I haven't had anyone call me Mr. Wilder with respect in more years than I care to count. If you're willing to take a chance on an old man who's got more yesterdays than tomorrows, then I reckon I'm willing to take a chance on a woman brave enough to bet her future on a stranger. The preacher they found was a Methodist circuit rider, named Reverend Polk, a spare man with gentle hands and kind eyes who'd been watering his horse at the station trough. When they explained their situation, he studied them both with the measuring gaze of someone who'd seen plenty of human nature in his travels. This is unusual, he said finally. I generally like to counsel couples before marriage, make sure they understand what they're undertaking. Reverend, Rosalie said, we understand we're strangers. We understand this isn't a love match. But we also understand that sometimes life doesn't give you the luxury of conventional courtship. Sometimes you have to make the best choice you can with what's in front of you. And what's in front of you? A chance, Gus said simply. Maybe the last good chance either of us will get. Reverend Polk nodded slowly. Well then, if you're both certain, we can make this legal and proper. But I want your word, both of you, that you'll treat this marriage with the respect it deserves, regardless of how it started. You have it, they said in unison, and something in that moment of speaking together made them both straighten a little, as if they'd already begun to change. The ceremony was brief, but meaningful, conducted on the station platform with the station master and a traveling drummer as witnesses. When Reverend Polk pronounced them husband and wife, the setting sun painted the sky the color of old roses, and somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its liquid song. Well, Mrs. Wilder, Gus said, and the name seemed to sit naturally on his tongue. I suppose we ought to figure out how to get ourselves to Colorado Territory. I suppose we should, Mr. Wilder, she replied. And for the first time in months, Rosalie felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. The station master, who'd been watching the proceedings with barely concealed amazement, cleared his throat. There's a freight wagon heading west in the morning, he offered. Driver might take passengers for the right price. How much? Rosalie asked. More than we've got, I'd wager, Gus said quietly, but Rosalie was already reaching into her carpetbag, pulling out a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Inside was a cameo brooch, the only thing of value she'd managed to keep when the creditors came calling. This was my grandmother's, she said. It ought to be worth enough for passage. Gus caught her hand gently before she could unwrap it completely. Now hold on. We don't need to be selling family heirlooms just yet. He pulled a leather pouch from his vest pocket, weighing it in his palm. I've got enough put by for our passage, and maybe a little extra for supplies. We saved the brooch for when we really need it. It was a small gesture, but it spoke of partnership, of consideration for her feelings and her history. Standing there in the gathering darkness of the railway platform, carpetbag at her feet, and her hand still resting in his gentle grip, Rosalie found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the desperate mistake it appeared to be. Thank you, she said softly, and meant more than just the money. Thank you, he replied, and she knew he understood exactly what she meant. As the last light faded from the western sky, they made their preparations for the journey ahead. Two people who'd been cast aside by the world, now bound together by hope, necessity, and the faintest beginning of something that might one day grow into something beautiful. The wagon ride to Colorado Territory took 3 days of bone-jarring travel over rutted roads that seemed to have been carved by flash floods and forgotten by any notion of maintenance. Rosalie's back ached constantly, and more than once she had to ask the driver, a taciturn man named Jedediah Morse, to stop so she could walk a bit and ease the pressure on her spine. Gus proved to be an ideal traveling companion patient with her needs, watchful of the road ahead and possessed of an endless store of stories that helped pass the miles. On the morning of the 4th day, they crested a hill and saw their destination, spread out below them like a painting come to life. The valley was broad and green, with a creek running silver through its center, and stands of aspen already beginning to turn gold with the approach of autumn. Mountains rose on all sides. There, peaks touched with early snow that caught the morning light like scattered diamonds. There, Gus said, pointing to a cluster of buildings nestled against the hillside about a mile distant. That should be the homestead, according to your letter. But as they drew closer, Rosalie's heart began to sink. Smoke was rising from the chimney. Clothes hung on a line behind the main building, and she could see cattle grazing in the meadow beyond. Someone was living there, and by all appearances, they'd been living there for some time. That's not right, she said, pulling out her husband's letter and reading it again. The deed says this land belongs to the Kemp family. It should be empty. Gus's expression had turned grim. Well, we'll just have to see what's what. Sometimes these things get complicated, especially in territories where the law is still catching up to the settlements. Jedediah Morse pulled his wagon to a halt in front of the main house, a sturdy log structure that showed signs of recent repair and improvement. A man emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and Rosalie's first impression was of someone who'd grown comfortable with possession. He was perhaps 40 years old, stocky and sun-weathered, with the confident stride of a man who belonged exactly where he was. Help you folks? He called out, but there was wariness in his voice. Gus climbed down from the wagon with careful dignity and helped Rosalie to the ground. Name's Augustus Wilder, he said. This is my wife, Rosalie. We're here about this land. The man's expression hardened. What about it? Rosalie stepped forward, the deed clutched in her hand. This property belongs to me by inheritance. My late husband was Thomas Kemp, nephew to Samuel Kemp, who filed the original claim. I'm Buck Henley, the man replied, crossing his arms over his chest. And I've been working this land for 3 years now. Put my sweat and money into improvements. Brought it from scrub to productive ranch. I don't know anything about any Kemps. The deed says otherwise, Rosalie said, offering him the paper. Samuel Kemp filed this claim in 1868, proved it up proper, and left it to family when he died. Henley took the deed, but barely glanced at it before handing it back. Papers can say anything. Fact is, when I got here, this place was abandoned. No one living here, buildings falling down, land going to waste. I've made it what it is now. That doesn't make it yours, Gus said quietly, but there was steel in his voice that made Henley look at him more carefully. You looking for trouble? Old man? I'm looking for justice. There's a difference. A woman appeared in the doorway of the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She was younger than Henley, with tired eyes and the pale complexion of someone who worked mostly indoors. Behind her, 2 children peered out with curious faces. Buck? She called. What's going on? Nothing, Martha. Just some folks with mistaken ideas about who owns what. Rosalie felt her resolve waver slightly at the sight of the children. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the situation, there was clearly a family established here, a life that would be disrupted by her claim. But then the baby moved inside her, a strong kick that reminded her she had her own family to think about. Mr. Henley, she said, I don't want to cause trouble for you and your family, but this land is legally mine, and I need it. I'm going to have a baby soon, and we need a place to build a life. Then you should have come 3 years ago, Henley replied harshly. I've put too much work into this place to hand it over to strangers with old papers. Those old papers are legal documents, Gus pointed out, filed and recorded proper. In a territory that barely had law officers 3 years ago, where the nearest courthouse was 100 miles away. Henley shook his head. I claim this land by right of improvement and occupation. That ought to count for something. It counts for something, Gus agreed, but not for ownership. The conversation might have continued in circles, but it was interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. 3 riders came up the valley at a steady pace, and even from a distance, there was something official about their bearing. Damn, Henley muttered under his breath. The lead rider was a tall man with a badge pinned to his vest and the weathered look of someone who'd spent years enforcing law in difficult places. He pulled up near the wagon and touched his hat brim. Politely, "Afternoon, folks. I'm Sheriff Daniels. Got word there might be some kind of dispute out here." "No dispute," Henley said quickly. "Just a misunderstanding. Is that so?" The sheriff's eyes moved from Henley to Gus and Rosalie. "And what's your understanding of the situation?" Rosalie stepped forward and offered him the deed. "Sheriff, this property legally belongs to me through inheritance from my late husband's family, but we arrived to find it occupied." Sheriff Daniels examined the document carefully, and Rosalie noticed that unlike Henley, he actually read it. When he finished, he looked up with a troubled expression. "This appears to be in order," he said. "Samuel Kemp filed this claim in '68, proved it up, according to the requirements, and the inheritance is clearly documented." He turned to Henley. "Buck, you got any papers on this place?" "I got 3 years of improvements and a family to protect," Henley replied stubbornly. "That's not what I asked." Henley's jaw worked for a moment before he answered. No papers. But I've been here, working this land, making it productive. That ought to count for something." "It does count for something," Sheriff Daniels agreed. "Question is, what exactly does it count for?" He studied the group thoughtfully. "This is the kind of situation that tends to turn ugly if folks aren't careful. Mrs. Wilder, you have the legal right to this property. Mr. Henley, you've made substantial improvements and have a family established here. Both of those things matter. So, what do you suggest?" Gus asked. "I suggest you all take some time to think about this. Maybe there's a solution that doesn't leave anybody completely in the cold." The sheriff tucked the deed into his shirt pocket. "I'm going to take this back to town and have the territorial judge take a look at it. In the meantime, I don't want any trouble from anybody. Mrs. Wilder, you and your husband are welcome to make camp on the property. It is legally yours. Mr. Henley, you and your family stay put for now. Nobody makes any moves until we get this sorted out proper." "How long will that take?" Rosalie asked. "Judge comes through about once a month. He's due back in 2 weeks." Sheriff Daniels remounted his horse. "Until then, I want everyone to keep their heads cool and their guns holstered. This territory's seen enough violence over land disputes." After the sheriff and his men rode away, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Henley looked like a man who'd been backed into a corner, while his wife Martha watched from the doorway with obvious anxiety. "We'll make our camp down by the creek," Gus said finally. "Give everyone some space to think." "This isn't over," Henley said quietly. "No," Gus agreed, and there was something in his voice that made Henley take a step back. "I don't imagine it is." As they made their way down to the creek with their few belongings, Rosalie felt the weight of the situation settling on her shoulders. She'd come here hoping for a new beginning, but instead she'd found another conflict, another struggle. And with the baby due in less than 2 months, she couldn't afford a prolonged legal battle. "What do you think will happen?" she asked Gus, as he began setting up their makeshift camp. "Hard to say. Law's one thing, but possession is another. And that man's got a family to protect." Gus straightened slowly, one hand pressed to his lower back. "What I do know is that this isn't going to be settled easy, and we'd better prepare ourselves for the long haul." That night, as they sat by their small campfire, and listened to the sounds of the Henley family settling down for sleep in what should have been their house. Rosalie found herself wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. She'd married a stranger, traveled hundreds of miles, and now found herself homeless again, camping on land that was legally hers, but practically beyond her reach. But when Gus reached over and gently took her hand, offering the simple comfort of human connection, she felt a small spark of hope kindle in her chest. Whatever came next, at least she wouldn't face it alone. The first week of their strange standoff passed with the careful politeness of people trying not to step on a snake. Gus and Rosalie had made their camp comfortable enough, with a canvas shelter rigged between two sturdy cottonwoods and a proper fire circle lined with creek stones. Gus proved surprisingly capable at camp life, his old cowboy skills serving them well as he showed Rosalie how to bank a fire for the night and filter creek water through sand and charcoal. But it was on the fifth morning that things began to change in ways none of them expected. Rosalie woke to the sound of shouting from the direction of the homestead. She struggled to her feet, one hand pressed to her aching back, and peered through the morning mist that rose from the creek. Gus was already up, standing alert and listening, his hand resting on the butt of the old Colt revolver he'd taken to wearing again. "Stay here," he said quietly, but Rosalie was already shaking her head. "If there's trouble, I need to know about it. This is my land they're fighting over." They made their way up the gentle slope toward the house, moving carefully through the dew-wet grass. As they drew closer, the source of the commotion became clear. Buck Henley was standing in his front yard, facing down two men on horseback, while his wife Martha stood in the doorway with her children pressed close behind her. The mounted men were strangers, hard-looking characters with a kind of confidence that came from carrying guns and knowing how to use them. The older of the two, a man with graying hair and cold eyes, was speaking in the measured tones of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Told you before, Henley. Mr. Cassidy's been patient, but his patience has limits. You owe money, and one way or another, you're going to pay." "I told you I'd have it by month's end," Henley replied, but there was desperation in his voice. "The cattle are ready for market, and cattle that are grazing on disputed land," the man interrupted. "Cattle that might not be yours to sell if this legal business doesn't go your way." It was then that Gus stepped into view, moving with the careful, deliberate pace of a man who'd learned to make every motion count. "Morning, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying easily across the yard. "Seems like you're having a discussion that's getting a bit heated." The two riders turned toward him, and Rosalie saw their hands drop toward their guns in an automatic response to potential threat. But something about Gus's bearing, the way he stood, the way he carried himself, made them pause. "This is private business, old man," the gray-haired rider said. "No concern of yours." "Well now," Gus replied, "when it's happening on my wife's property, I reckon it becomes my concern." He moved a step closer, and there was something in his movement that reminded Rosalie powerfully of a wolf circling its prey. "Question is, what business do you boys have here?" "Who the hell are you?" the younger rider demanded. "Name's Augustus Wilder," Gus said simply. The gray-haired man's eyes narrowed. "Wilder? I know that name. You wouldn't be the hell's wind that used to run with the Bar T outfit down in Texas? I might be. Heard you were dead." "Rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated," Gus said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Now, about that business you have here." The man studied Gus for a long moment, clearly reassessing the situation. "Henley owes Mr. Cassidy money. We're here to collect." "How much money?" $200, Henley said before the debt collectors could answer. "I borrowed it to buy seed and supplies last spring. Thought I'd have a good harvest to pay it back, but the summer was dry, and 200 plus interest," the gray-haired man corrected. "Makes it 300 now," Gus whistled low. "That's considerable interest for a few months. Mr. Cassidy provides a service to folks who can't get money from regular banks. The risk is higher, so the rates are higher." "I see." Gus seemed to consider this. "And what happens if Mr. Henley can't pay?" "Then Mr. Cassidy takes possession of whatever collateral was offered. In this case, that would be the livestock and improvements on this property." Rosalie felt her heart sink. If Henley lost his cattle and improvements to debt collectors, it would make the legal situation even more complicated. She found herself stepping forward despite Gus's earlier instruction to stay back. "How long does he have?" she asked. The gray-haired man touched his hat brim politely. "Ma'am, Mr. Cassidy has been generous. Originally, payment was due at harvest time. He's extended that to the end of this month." "That's barely 2 weeks," Rosalie said. "Yes, Mom." "Same 2 weeks. You folks have to get this land dispute sorted out." The man's smile was not pleasant. "Interesting how these things work out, isn't it?" Gus stepped protectively closer to Rosalie. "Seems like an awful coincidence." "Life's full of coincidences," the man replied. "We'll be back in 2 weeks. Have our money ready, Henley." He touched his hat again. "Ma'am, Mr. Wilder." After the riders departed, an uncomfortable silence settled over the group. Buck Henley looked like a man who'd been cornered by wolves, while his wife Martha had emerged from the house with tears in her eyes. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Henley said quietly. "This isn't how I wanted things to be. How much of that debt is real?" Gus asked bluntly. Henley flushed. "It's real enough. I did borrow money from Cassidy. Maybe not 200, and certainly not at the interest rate he's claiming, but—" He shrugged helplessly. "I needed the money, and he was the only one offering." "And now you're caught between the devil and the deep blue sea," Rosalie observed. "Even if you win the right to stay on this land, you might lose everything to debt collectors." "That's about the size of it." Gus had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke up. "Tell me about this Cassidy. What kind of man is he?" "The kind that owns half the businesses in the county and has his fingers in the other half," Henley replied. "Word is he's been buying up land cheap from folks who can't pay their debts, then selling it to mining companies and railroad developers for 10 times what he paid." "And you think he's got his eye on this particular piece of land?" "I know he does. He made me an offer to buy me out 6 months ago. When I turned him down, suddenly my debt payment schedule got moved up." Rosalie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You think he's behind the timing of all this? The debt coming due right when we show up to claim the land?" "I think Elias Cassidy doesn't believe in coincidences," Henley said grimly. "And I think he's been planning this for a long time." That evening, as they sat around their campfire, Gus cleaned and checked his old Colt with the methodical care of a man who'd done it 10,000 times before. The firelight caught the silver inlay on the grips, and Rosalie could see the wear patterns where his hands had held the weapon through years of use. "You think there's going to be trouble," she said. It wasn't a question. "There's already trouble," Gus replied, not looking up from his work. "Question is what kind of trouble, and how much." "Those spurs you wear," she said, watching him work. "They're silver, aren't they? Real silver?" Gus glanced down at his feet, where the old spurs caught the firelight. "They are. Had them made in San Antonio after my first really good cattle drive. Thought I was going to conquer the world in those days. They're beautiful. They must be worth something." "I suppose they are." He looked up at her then, understanding in his eyes. "But not enough to solve Henley's debt problem, if that's what you're thinking." "I was thinking that maybe there's a way to help. If we're going to be neighbors, we might as well be friendly neighbors." "Rosalie," Gus said gently, "that man's problems aren't our responsibility." "Maybe not. But if Cassidy is really behind all this timing, then his problems are about to become our problems anyway." She shifted uncomfortably, trying to find a position that didn't make her back ache. "Besides those children, they didn't choose any of this." Gus nodded slowly. "No, they didn't." He holstered the Colt and leaned back against his saddle. "You know, I've been thinking about something. Henley said Cassidy made him an offer 6 months ago. That was long before you showed up with your deed. Makes a man wonder what Cassidy knew, and when he knew it." "You think he knew about my claim all along?" "I think Elias Cassidy is the kind of man who makes it his business to know things. And I think we might be walking into something a lot more complicated than a simple land dispute." As if summoned by their conversation, a rider appeared at the edge of their firelight. It was a young man, barely out of his teens, with nervous eyes and the fidgety manner of someone carrying an unwelcome message. Mr. Wilder? Mrs. Wilder? My name's Tommy Fletcher. I work for Mr. Cassidy, and he'd like to invite you both to dinner tomorrow evening. Discuss this situation like civilized folks. Gus and Rosalie exchanged glances. That's very kind of Mr. Cassidy, Rosalie said carefully. But we're not really dressed for dinner parties. Oh, he said to tell you to come as you are, ma'am. Says he's a simple man who appreciates simple folks. Tommy's grin was nervous and didn't quite reach his eyes. 8 o'clock at his house in town. The big white one with the columns. You can't miss it. After the young man rode away, Gus stared into the fire for a long time. Well, he said finally, I guess we're about to meet the man behind the curtain. Are we going? Oh, we're going, Gus said, and when he looked at her, she saw something in his eyes that reminded her powerfully of the stories about Hell's Wind. Wouldn't miss it for the world. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to their Creekside camp. Dr. Samuel Morrison was a man in his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and the gentle manner of someone who'd spent years tending to human suffering. He approached their camp leading a saddled horse and carrying a black medical bag that had seen considerable use. Mrs. Wilder? He called out as he drew near. I'm Dr. Morrison. I heard there was an expectant mother camping out here, and I thought I should introduce myself. Rosalie looked up from where she'd been washing clothes in the creek, one hand pressed to her lower back. Doctor, I'm afraid we don't have money for medical services. Who said anything about money? Dr. Morrison smiled and tipped his hat. Professional courtesy, ma'am. I don't like the idea of any woman facing childbirth without proper medical attention nearby. Gus emerged from the stand of trees where he'd been gathering firewood, his arms full of deadfall branches. Doctor, he said with a respectful nod, that's mighty kind of you. Mr. Wilder, I presume? Dr. Morrison set down his bag and shook Gus's hand. I've heard quite a bit about you in town, both the old stories and the new ones. All true, I expect, Gus said with a wry smile. The question is which ones you choose to believe. Dr. Morrison chuckled. Oh, I've learned to take frontier legends with a grain of salt. But I will say this, the way you handled Cassidy's men yesterday, his people talking. It's been a long time since anyone in this county stood up to them like that. Word travels fast, Rosalie observed. Small town, ma'am. And when something interesting happens, it tends to be the main topic of conversation at the barber shop and the general store. The doctor turned his attention back to her. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to examine you. Make sure everything is progressing normally. The examination took place in the privacy of their canvas shelter, with Gus standing guard outside. Doctor. Morrison's hands were gentle and sure, and his questions were thorough, but not intrusive. When he finished, he sat back with a satisfied expression. Everything appears to be developing normally, he said. The baby is positioned properly, and you seem to be in good health despite the unusual circumstances. When do you calculate the birth will occur? 6 weeks, perhaps 7, Rosalie said. It's hard to be certain. Based on what I can determine, I'd say 6 weeks is about right. Dr. Morrison repacked his instruments carefully. Mrs. Wilder, I want you to know that when your time comes, you won't be facing it alone. I'll make sure to be available, regardless of how this land situation resolves itself. Thank you, Rosalie said, and meant it. The knowledge that she'd have medical assistance during the birth lifted a weight from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she was carrying. When they emerged from the shelter, they found that Gus had been busy. He'd built up the fire and set coffee to brewing, and he'd arranged 3 log seats around the fire circle. More importantly, Rosalie noticed, he'd positioned himself where he could see all approaches to their camp, while still maintaining a conversational distance. Coffee's about ready, Gus said. Doctor, you're welcome to stay if you've got time. I'd be pleased to, Dr. Morrison said, settling onto one of the log seats. To tell you the truth, I was hoping we could talk about something beyond medical matters, such as Elias Cassidy, and this dinner invitation you've received. Gus poured coffee into 3 tin cups and handed them around. What about it? Mr. Wilder, I've been practicing medicine in this county for 15 years. I've seen what happens when people cross Cassidy, and I've treated the results. He's not, as he, a man who invites folks to dinner out of social courtesy. What kind of man is he? Rosalie asked. Dr. Morrison considered his words carefully. Intelligent, ruthless, patient when it serves his purposes, but utterly without mercy when he decides. Someone is standing in his way. He sipped his coffee thoughtfully. He came here about 10 years ago with money and connections back east. Started buying up businesses, extending credit to folks who couldn't get it elsewhere, acquiring land from people who couldn't pay there. Debts. Sounds like a businessman, Gus said neutrally. Oh, he's that. But he's also something more. Or perhaps I should say something less. The doctor's expression had grown troubled. I've seen the results of what happens to people who oppose him. Accidents, illnesses that strike at convenient times, fires that destroy property just when someone's about to sell to his competitors. You're saying he's dangerous. I'm saying he's not content to simply win. He needs to own everything and everyone around him, and people who won't be owned. Dr. Morrison shrugged. Well, let's just say this county has seen its share of mysterious departures and unfortunate accidents. The three of them sat in thoughtful silence for a while, listening to the sound of the creek and the distant lowing of Henley's cattle. Finally, Rosalie spoke up. Doctor, what do you know about our land claim? About the legal aspects of this situation? I know that your deed appears to be legitimate. I also know that Cassidy has been interested in this particular piece of property for years. There are rumors that the railroad is planning to extend a spur line through this valley, which would make the land extremely valuable. And Henley? Gus asked. How does he fit into all this? Buck Henley is a good man who made the mistake of borrowing money from the wrong person at the wrong time. Cassidy has been maneuvering him into this position for months, maybe longer. Dr. Morrison finished his coffee and set the cup aside. I think you'll find that tonight's dinner invitation is Cassidy's opening move in what he expects to be. Very short game. What kind of offer do you think he'll make? Rosalie asked. Money, probably. Enough to make you think seriously about forgetting your claim and moving on. He'll be charming and reasonable, and he'll make it sound like the most sensible thing in the world. And if we don't accept, then things will get more complicated very quickly. As Dr. Morrison prepared to leave, he pulled something from his saddlebag, a small wooden cradle, beautifully crafted and polished to a warm glow. I've been working on this in my spare time, he said, somewhat embarrassed. Every baby deserves a proper cradle, and I thought, well, given your circumstances. Rosalie's eyes filled with tears. Doctor, it's beautiful. But we couldn't possibly. Nonsense. Consider it a welcome gift to the community. This county needs more families like yours, people with backbone and principles. He handed the cradle to Gus, who accepted it with obvious reverence. This is fine work, Gus said, running his weathered hands over the smooth wood. Beautiful craftsmanship. My grandfather was a carpenter, Dr. Morrison explained. He taught me that working with wood is good for the soul. Helps a man think clearly about what's really important. After the doctor rode away, Gus spent a long time examining the cradle, his fingers tracing the careful joinery and the delicate carving along the sides. There were tiny flowers carved into the headboard, and the rockers were perfectly balanced to provide a gentle, soothing motion. It's perfect, Rosalie said softly, settling beside him on the log seat. I can hardly believe a stranger would do something so kind for us. He's not a stranger anymore, Gus replied. And I don't think we are either. Somehow, without even trying, we've become part of this community, even though we've been here less than a week. Sometimes it doesn't take long to know where you belong. Gus set the cradle carefully in their shelter, positioning it where it would be safe from the elements. The question is, will we be allowed to stay long enough to enjoy it? That afternoon, Gus surprised Rosalie by announcing that he was going to walk up to the Henley place. Thought I might offer to help Buck with some chores, he said. Man's got his hands full, and it's clear he's been trying to do everything himself. That's kind of you, Rosalie said. But are you sure he'll welcome the help? Only one way to find out. Gus returned 2 hours later with dirt under his fingernails and satisfaction in his eyes. Helped him repair a section of fence that was about to give way, he reported, and had a good talk while we worked. About what? About Cassidy. About this land. About what really happened to Samuel Kemp. Gus settled beside her and began cleaning his hands with water from the creek. Turns out Buck knows more about your husband's uncle than he let on initially. What kind of things? Samuel Kemp didn't just abandon this place, Rosalie. According to Buck, he was forced out. Cassidy wanted the land even then, but Kemp wouldn't sell. Then one night, there was a fire. Burned down the barn and killed most of Kemp's livestock. The old man took it as a sign and left for California, where he died a few months later. Rosalie felt a chill run down her spine. You think Cassidy was responsible for the fire? I think Cassidy has been playing a long game, and we've just become the latest pieces on his board. Gus looked toward the distant town, where smoke was beginning to rise from evening cooking fires. But here's the thing about games, Rosalie. Sometimes the pieces don't move the way the player expects them to. As evening approached and they prepared for their dinner with Cassidy, Rosalie found herself thinking about the cradle Dr. Morrison had brought them. It sat in their shelter like a promise of the future, a tangible reminder that their child would soon need a safe place to sleep and grow. Whatever happened tonight, whatever Cassidy offered or threatened, she was determined that her baby would have that safe place here, on the land that was rightfully theirs. Ready? Gus asked, offering her his arm as they prepared to walk into town. Ready, she replied, and meant it. Whatever came next, they would face it together. Elias Cassidy's house dominated the main street of town, like a declaration of prosperity and power. 3 stories of gleaming white clapboard rose above perfectly manicured grounds, with tall columns supporting a wraparound porch that spoke of southern gentility transplanted to the Colorado frontier. Gas lamps flanked the front door, casting warm circles of light onto the painted steps and through the tall windows. Rosalie could see the glow of crystal chandeliers. Impressive, Gus murmured as they approached the front gate. Man likes to make a statement. The statement being that he has money and isn't afraid to show it, Rosalie replied, smoothing her hands over her best dress, which was still travel-worn and hardly suitable for such grandeur. The door was opened before they could knock by a woman in a crisp black dress with a white apron. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. Mr. and Mrs. Wilder, I presume? I'm Mrs. Garrett, Mr. Cassidy's housekeeper. He's expecting you in the parlor. The interior of the house was as impressive as the exterior suggested. Rich carpets covered polished hardwood floors. Oil paintings in gilded frames adorned the walls, and furniture that clearly came from back east filled rooms designed to showcase wealth and taste. Mrs. Garrett led them through a hallway lined with bookcases to a parlor, where a fire crackled invitingly in a marble fireplace. Elias Cassidy rose from a leather chair as they entered, and Rosalie's first impression was of a man who'd learned to use his appearance as a weapon. He was perhaps 50 years old, tall and lean, with silver-touched hair and intelligent gray eyes. His suit was perfectly tailored, his manner was gracious, and his smile was warm enough to melt ice, but somehow never quite reached those calculating eyes. Mr. and Mrs. Wilder, he said, extending his hand in greeting. Welcome to my home. I'm Elias Cassidy, and I'm delighted to finally meet you both. His handshake was firm without being aggressive. His voice carried the cultured tones of education and breeding, and his manner suggested nothing more threatening than a successful businessman entertaining guests. But Rosalie noticed how his eyes lingered on Gus's gun belt, and how his smile became a fraction more genuine when he looked at her obvious pregnancy. Mr. Cassidy, Gus replied politely, thank you for the invitation. Please, sit down. Make yourselves comfortable. Cassidy gestured toward a settee positioned near the fire. Mrs. Garrett has prepared a wonderful meal, but first I thought we might have a drink and get acquainted. Mrs. Wilder, perhaps some tea? And Mr. Wilder, I have an excellent whiskey that I think you'd appreciate. The tea service that appeared was elegant china, and the whiskey came in crystal glasses that caught the firelight like amber jewels. Cassidy was the perfect host, asking about their journey, commenting on the weather, inquiring after Rosalie's health with the kind of solicitous attention that would have been charming if she hadn't known what Dr. Morrison had told them about his true nature. "I understand you've had some excitement out at the old Kemp place," Cassidy said eventually, settling back in his chair with his own glass of whiskey. "Legal disputes can be so unpleasant, especially when there are families involved." "Yes," Rosalie replied carefully. "It's an unfortunate situation all around." "Indeed, Buck Henley is a good man, though perhaps not the most practical when it comes to business matters. I've tried to help him several times over the years, but—" Cassidy shrugged eloquently. "Some people have difficulty accepting assistance, even when it's offered in good faith." Gus sipped his whiskey and said nothing, but Rosalie could feel the tension in his stillness. "Of course," Cassidy continued, "your own situation is quite different. You have legitimate legal claim to the property, from what I understand. That must be very satisfying, knowing that you have secure tenure." "Satisfying enough," Rosalie said. "Although I imagine it's also somewhat daunting. Homesteading is difficult work under the best of circumstances, and with a baby on the way." He smiled sympathetically. "I admire your courage, Mrs. Wilder, but I wonder if you've fully considered the practical challenges you'll be facing." "Such as?" Gus spoke for the first time since the pleasantries had ended. "Well, the land needs considerable work to be truly productive. The buildings require extensive repair and improvement. There's the matter of livestock, equipment, seed for planting next spring." Cassidy ticked off the points on his fingers. "And of course, all of that requires capital investment." "Substantial capital investment we'll manage," Rosalie said. "I'm sure you will. But at what cost?" Cassidy leaned forward slightly, his expression growing more earnest. "Mrs. Wilder, forgive me for speaking plainly, but you're about to become a mother. Your husband is a man of considerable experience and reputation, but he's also not as young as he once was. Is it wise to take on such overwhelming challenges when there might be easier alternatives?" "What kind of alternatives?" Gus asked, though. His tone suggested he already knew where this conversation was heading. Cassidy smiled and rose to his feet, walking to an ornate desk near the window. He returned with a folded document that he placed on the table between them. "I'd like to make you an offer," he said. "A generous offer for your land claim. Enough money to set you up comfortably anywhere you'd like to go. California, perhaps, where the climate would be better for your health, Mrs. Wilder. Or back east, where there are established communities and proper medical facilities." Rosalie picked up the document and unfolded it. The figure written there made her breath catch it. Was more money than she'd ever seen in one place, more than enough to start a new life anywhere they chose. "It's generous," she admitted. "It's more than generous," Cassidy said. "It's enough to ensure that your child grows up with every advantage: education, opportunities, security." He paused. "Things that might be difficult to provide on a struggling homestead in rough country." Gus set down his whiskey glass with deliberate care. "And in return?" "In return, you sign over your claim to the property. Clean, legal, no complications. You walk away with enough money to secure your family's future, and I take responsibility for resolving the situation with the Henleys in a way that's fair to everyone involved." "What does fair to everyone mean exactly?" Rosalie asked. "It means the Henleys can stay on as tenant farmers if they choose, or I can help them relocate if they prefer. Either way, they won't be left destitute." Cassidy's smile was warm and reassuring. "I'm not an ogre, Mrs. Wilder. I simply believe that business should be conducted in a way that benefits everyone involved." They sat in silence for a moment, the offer hanging in the air between them like smoke from the fireplace. Finally, Mrs. Garrett appeared in the doorway to announce that dinner was served. The dining room was as impressive as the rest of the house, with a mahogany table that could have seated 12, and a chandelier that cast warm light over bone china and silver serving pieces. The meal was expertly prepared roast beef with vegetables, fresh bread still warm from the oven, and wine that Cassidy explained had been imported from France. Throughout the meal, their host was charming and entertaining, regaling them with stories of his business ventures and asking thoughtful questions about their backgrounds. He seemed genuinely interested in Gus's experiences on the cattle drives, and he spoke knowledgeably about the challenges facing pregnant women on the frontier. But Rosalie noticed that he never directly pressured them about his offer. Instead, he painted subtle pictures of the comfortable life they could have with his money, the security it would provide, the opportunities it would open. He was, she realized, a master at making his proposals seem not just reasonable, but inevitable. It was only when they reached dessert, a delicate custard that melted on the tongue, that he pulled out what Rosalie later realized was his trump card. "I hope you don't mind," he said, producing a leather portfolio from a sideboard, "but I took the liberty of doing some research into your family history. Mrs. Wilder, the Kemp family has quite an interesting story." He opened the portfolio and spread several documents on the table. "These are records from the Territorial Land Office. Samuel Kemp did indeed file the original claim, just as your deed indicates. But what's interesting is what happened afterward." Rosalie felt her heart beginning to race, though she wasn't sure why. "You see," Cassidy continued, "Samuel Kemp sold the property to me 3 years ago, legally and properly, with all the required documentation. I have the deed transfer right here, signed and witnessed." He placed the document where they could both see it. The signature at the bottom was shaky but clearly legible. "Samuel Kemp. But that's impossible," Rosalie said. "My husband received a letter from his uncle just before he died. He said the land was ours." "I'm afraid your husband's uncle was not entirely truthful with him," Cassidy said gently. "Perhaps he felt guilty about selling the family land. Perhaps he hoped to buy it back before anyone discovered what had happened. But the legal facts are clear. I've owned that property for 3 years." Gus reached for the document, studying it carefully. When he looked up, his expression was troubled. "This appears to be legitimate." "It is legitimate. I understand this is shocking news, and I sympathize with your situation. That's why I'm prepared to offer you compensation for your trouble, even though I have no legal obligation to do so." Cassidy's voice was kind, understanding, the voice of a man trying to do right by people who'd been misled. Rosalie felt the world spinning around her. If Cassidy was telling the truth, then everything they'd planned, everything they'd hoped for, was built on a lie. They had no claim to the land, no right to be there, no future beyond whatever charity this man was willing to offer. "I need some air," she said, pushing back from the table. Cassidy was immediately solicitous. "Of course, Mrs. Garrett. Perhaps you could show Mrs. Wilder to the garden. The evening air might be refreshing." But as Rosalie rose unsteadily to her feet, Gus caught her arm gently. When she looked into his eyes, she saw something there that steadied her. Not defeat, but calculation. Not despair, but the careful assessment of a man who'd learned not to trust appearances. "We'll need some time to consider all this," he said to Cassidy. "It's quite a lot to take in." "Of course. Take all the time you need. But don't take too long. The judge will be here in a week, and it would be better for everyone if this matter were resolved before then." As they prepared to leave, Cassidy handed them the portfolio. "You're welcome to have these documents examined by anyone you choose. I want you to be completely satisfied that everything is legitimate and above board." Walking back through the dark streets toward their camp, neither of them spoke until they were well away from the house. Then Gus stopped under a street lamp and pulled out the deed transfer, examining it closely in the gaslight. "What do you think?" Rosalie asked. "I think," Gus said slowly, "that Elias Cassidy is very good at what he does. And I think we'd better be very careful about what we believe and what we don't. But the signature looks real enough. Question is, what Samuel Kemp was thinking when he signed it, and what Cassidy might have left out of the story." Gus folded the document carefully and tucked it into his coat. "We're not beaten yet, Rosalie. Not by a long shot." But as they walked back toward their creekside camp, Rosalie couldn't shake the feeling that they just stepped into a trap that had been years in the making. The sleepless night that followed their dinner with Cassidy was filled with whispered conversations and worried silences. Rosalie lay in their makeshift bed, feeling the baby move restlessly inside her as if sensing her distress, while Gus sat by the dying fire, studying the deed transfer by lamplight and occasionally making notes on a piece of paper with a stub. Of pencil dot when dawn finally came, it brought Dr. Morrison riding hard toward their camp, his medical bag bouncing against his horse's flank, and concern written plainly across his face. "I heard about last night," he said without preamble as he dismounted. "The whole town's talking about Cassidy's documents. Are you both all right?" "As all right as we can be, given the circumstances," Rosalie replied, accepting Gus's help to rise from their bedroll. "Doctor, you know this country and these people better than we do. Is it possible that Samuel Kemp really did sell the land to Cassidy?" Dr. Morrison's expression was troubled. "Possible? Yes, but probable?" He shook his head. "I knew Samuel Kemp fairly well in his last years here. He was a stubborn old coot who'd rather die than give up what he saw as family's legacy. The idea that he'd sell to Cassidy voluntarily." The doctor shrugged. "It doesn't fit the man I knew." "But the signature looked genuine," Gus said. "Oh, I'm sure it is genuine. The question is, what circumstances led to Samuel signing that paper?" Dr. Morrison tied his horse to a nearby tree and joined them around the fire. "There are ways to make a man sign documents that don't involve outright forgery, such as threats to family members, debts that come due suddenly, medical bills for a sick relative, accidents that could become fatal without proper care." The doctor's voice was grim. "Elias Cassidy is very good at creating situations where signing his papers seems like the only reasonable choice." Rosalie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You think he coerced Samuel?" "I think. Samuel Kemp left town very suddenly after a barn fire that killed his livestock and nearly took his house. I think he was a broken man who might have signed anything if he thought it would protect what little he had left." Dr. Morrison accepted the cup of coffee Gus offered. "But proving that 3 years after the fact, that's another matter entirely." They were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Buck Henley rode into their camp looking haggard, as if he too had spent a sleepless night wrestling with impossible choices. "Folks," he said, dismounting and accepting their invitation to join the impromptu council around the fire. "I heard about Cassidy's papers. Thought you should know he paid me a visit last night too." "What kind of visit?" Gus asked. "The kind where he offered to forgive my debt in exchange for testimony that Samuel Kemp told me he was planning to sell the land before he left." Henley's jaw was tight with anger. "Said it would help clear up any confusion about the legitimacy of the sale." "And what did you tell him?" "I told him Samuel Kemp never said any such thing to me, and I wouldn't lie under oath for him or anyone else." Henley poured himself coffee with hands that shook slightly. "But he made it clear that refusing his generous offer might have consequences for my family." Dr. Morrison leaned forward. "What kind of consequences?" "The kind where my debt gets sold to someone even less reasonable than Cassidy. The kind where my wife might have difficulty getting medical care if she takes sick. The kind where my children might find it hard to get into the schoolhouse come fall." Henley's voice was bitter. "He's very good at making threats without actually threatening." They sat in troubled silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the web of manipulation and pressure that Cassidy had woven around them. It was Gus who finally spoke up. "Buck, what do you know about that barn fire that drove Samuel off his land?" "Not much. Happened before I arrived. But old Pete Garrison was living in town then, working as a night watchman. He might remember something." "Is Pete still around?" "Lives in a cabin about 2 miles north of town. Spends most of his time prospecting, but he might talk to you if you approach him right." Dr. Morrison nodded. "Pete's a good man, honest as the day is long, but he's also cautious about getting involved in other people's troubles." "Then maybe it's time someone convinced him that this is his trouble too," Gus said, standing and beginning to gather his gear. "Rosalie, I want you to stay here with the doctor. Buck, would you mind keeping an eye on things while I ride out to talk to Pete?" "Gus," Rosalie protested, "maybe we should just take Cassidy's offer. The money would be enough to start over somewhere else, and with the baby coming." He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his weathered ones. "Rosalie, that money comes with strings attached, and those strings lead right back to Elias Cassidy. A man like that doesn't pay generously for something unless he expects to get back 10 times what he spends. But if his documents are legitimate, then we'll face that when we know for sure. But I'm not ready to give up on what's rightfully ours, based on papers that appeared mighty conveniently. His voice softened. Besides, I made you a promise when we married. I said I'd protect you and provide for you. Running away from the first real challenge we face doesn't seem like much of a way to keep that promise. After Gus left, Dr. Morrison suggested that he examine Rosalie again, partly for medical reasons but mostly, she suspected, to give her something to focus on besides their mounting troubles. The baby was active and healthy, he reported, and she was progressing normally despite the stress of their situation. "Doctor," she said as he repacked his instruments, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Are you married? Do you have children?" His smile was sad. "I was married. My wife died in childbirth 8 years ago, along with our son. It's part of why I'm so determined to see that you get proper care when your time comes. I'm sorry. I didn't know. How could you? But it's also why I understand what Gus is fighting. 4. A man needs something to protect, something to build toward. Take that away from him, and you might as well take away his soul." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a visitor neither of them expected. Martha Henley approached their camp, leading a pack mule and carrying a bundle that proved to contain fresh bread, butter, and preserves. "Mrs. Wilder," she said, somewhat shyly, "I thought you might appreciate some proper food. Camping isn't easy when you're carrying a child." "That's very kind," Rosalie said, genuinely touched. "Would you like some coffee?" "I'd like that very much." As the three of them sat around the fire, Martha revealed that she'd come for more than just a social visit. "I wanted to tell you something," she said, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. "About the night Samuel Kemp left town. What about it?" Dr. Morrison asked. "I was just a girl then, working as a seamstress for Mrs. Henderson at the general store. I was walking home late after finishing a wedding dress when I saw men riding away from the Kemp place. There was a glow in the sky, and I could smell smoke. Did you recognize any of the riders? It was dark, and they were moving fast. But one of them was riding a distinctive horse, a big paint stallion with white markings. I remember thinking it was beautiful, even under those circumstances." Dr. Morrison and Rosalie exchanged glances. "Martha," the doctor said carefully, "do you know anyone in the area who owns a paint stallion like that?" "Elias Cassidy bought one about 6 months before the fire. Used to show it off around town, like it was some kind of prize." Martha's voice dropped to a whisper. "I never told anyone about seeing those riders, because I was young and scared. But I've thought about it many times over the years. Would you be willing to tell this story to the judge when he comes to town?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks. "If it would help you folks, and if my husband agrees, then yes." Samuel Kemp was a good man who deserved better than what happened to him. After Martha left, Dr. Morrison and Rosalie spent the afternoon in quiet conversation, talking about everything except the crisis they were facing. The doctor proved to be well-read and thoughtful, with opinions on subjects ranging from poetry to politics. More importantly, he had a gift for making Rosalie feel that, despite their uncertain circumstances, she wasn't alone in facing the challenges ahead. When Gus returned in the late afternoon, his expression was grim, but not defeated. "Pete Garrison remembers the night of the fire," he reported, "and he remembers seeing riders heading away from the Kemp place around midnight. More importantly, he remembers finding something the next morning that he's kept all these years." "What kind of something?" Gus reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. When he unwrapped it, they saw a silver spur, tarnished with age, but clearly expensive and well made. Pete found this caught on a fence post near where the fire started. Said he meant to turn it in to the sheriff, but the sheriff in those days was less than reliable. Dr. Morrison examined the spur carefully. "This is custom work. See the initials engraved here? E.C. Elias Cassidy," Rosalie breathed. "Pete's willing to testify about finding this and about what he saw that night." Combined with Martha's testimony about the riders, we might have enough to cast serious doubt on the legitimacy of Cassidy's claim. For the first time since their dinner at Cassidy's house, Rosalie felt a spark of hope. So what do we do now? Now we prepare for a fight, Gus said, and there was something in his voice that reminded her powerfully of the legendary Hell's Wind. And we hope that when the judge arrives, justice means more to him than money. But even as they began to plan their strategy, all three of them knew that Elias Cassidy wouldn't give up easily. A man who'd spent years positioning his pieces on the board wouldn't hesitate to make new moves when his original plan was threatened. That night, as they lay in their bedroll listening to the sounds of the creek and the distant cattle, Gus surprised Rosalie by pulling something from his vest pocket. In the moonlight, she could see it was a simple gold band. "I know this isn't exactly the romantic gesture most women dream of," he said, his voice uncertain in a way she'd never heard before. "And I know our marriage started as an arrangement. But somewhere along the way, it's become something more. For me. If it has for you too, then maybe it's time this became a real marriage in all ways." The ring was nothing fancy, probably something he'd bought from the general store in town, but as he slipped it onto her finger, Rosalie felt her heart swell with emotions she thought she might never experience again. "Yes," she whispered, and meant more than just acceptance of the ring dot as they held each other in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of their disputed land. Both of them understood that whatever came next, they would face it not as strangers bound by convenience, but as husband and wife bound by something much stronger, love that had grown quietly in the space between desperate necessity and unexpected hope. The morning of the judge's arrival dawned clear and cold, with frost silvering the grass and hint of winter in the air that reminded everyone that the seasons were changing. Rosalie woke with an odd restlessness, her hands instinctively going to her belly where the baby seemed unusually active. She was arranging their few belongings in preparation for what might be their last day on the disputed land when her fingers brushed against something unusual in the corner of her carpetbag. "That's strange," she murmured, feeling along the edge of the bag's lining. There was a slight bulge, a thickness that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there, but she'd never noticed it in all the months since Thomas's death. Gus looked up from where he was checking his rifle. "What is it?" I think there might be something sewn into the lining of this bag." Her heart began to race as her fingers found what felt like a loose thread. Thomas always said his uncle was a careful man, someone who didn't trust banks or lawyers entirely. With trembling hands, she worked at the thread until it came loose, revealing a hidden pocket she'd never known existed. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, were several documents that made her breath catch in her throat. "Gus," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this." The first document was another deed, this one dated 2 months after the paper Cassidy had shown them. But this deed transferred the property not to Elias Cassidy, but to Thomas Kemp, Rosalie's late husband, with a note in Samuel's handwriting, "From my nephew Thomas and his heirs, the true inheritance of the Kemp family." The other deed was signed, "Under duress, and is hereby revoked." The second document was even more revealing, a detailed letter from Samuel to Thomas, explaining exactly what had happened the night of the barn fire and why he'd been forced to sign Cassidy's papers. "My dear nephew," the letter began in Samuel's careful script, "if you are reading this, then I am dead, and you have found the truth I could not reveal while I lived. Elias Cassidy is a devil who hides behind the mask of respectability, and he will stop at nothing to acquire the land he believes will make him rich." Gus read over her shoulder as Rosalie continued through the letter, her heart pounding with each revelation. "He came to me with papers claiming I owed money to various creditors' debts I had never incurred, but which seemed legitimate enough to a territorial judge who might not examine them too closely. When I refused his offer to buy my land to settle these fictitious debts, he made his intentions clear. The barn fire was no accident, and the men who set it made sure I knew that the house would be next, with me inside it, if I continued to resist." The letter went on to describe how Samuel had been forced to sign the deed transfer, but had immediately contacted a lawyer in Denver who helped him prepare the revocation and the new deed to Thomas. He'd hidden the documents and sent word to Thomas to come quickly, but his failing health had prevented him from explaining the full situation before his death. The most important thing, the letter concluded, is that you should know the land sits atop what I believe to be a substantial mineral deposit. I found signs of silver and possibly gold in the creek bed, but I told no one except the assayer in Denver, who confirmed my suspicions. Cassidy must not be allowed to profit from his crimes. The third document was the assayer's report, clearly stating that samples from the Kemp property showed significant mineral content that could prove extremely valuable with proper mining operations. That's why he wants it so badly, Rosalie breathed. It's not just about the railroad. There's silver in our land. Gus examined the documents carefully, his experienced eye checking for signs of forgery or deception. These look legitimate, he said finally. The paper's the right age, the ink's faded properly, and Samuel's handwriting matches what I've seen on other documents. But why didn't Thomas tell me about any of this? Probably because Samuel died before he could explain it fully, and Thomas died before he had a chance to come out here and investigate. Gus refolded the papers carefully. Or maybe he was planning to tell you, but didn't want to get your hopes up until he was certain. They were still marveling at their discovery when Dr. Morrison arrived with news that sent their elation crashing back to earth. The judge is in town, he announced, but so is something else. Cassidy's brought in reinforcements, 6 men who've got the look of professional gunfighters about them. Word is they're here to maintain order during the legal proceedings. 6 men? Gus's expression had turned grim. That's not about maintaining order. That's about intimidation. It gets worse. Sheriff Daniels rode out of town this morning on urgent business that's likely to keep him away until after the judge leaves. Mighty convenient timing, if you ask me. Rosalie felt her hope beginning to crumble. Even with these documents, if Cassidy has gunmen and the sheriff's not here to keep order, then we're on our own, Gus finished. But we're not beaten yet. These papers change everything, and even Cassidy's hired guns can't argue with legal documents. Dr. Morrison examined the hidden papers with growing excitement. This is exactly what we needed. Proof that Samuel was coerced, evidence that the original deed transfer was invalid, and clear title to the property. His expression sobered. But getting the judge to hear this evidence might be more challenging than we'd hoped. Why? Because Cassidy's gotten to him first. Judge Whitman arrived on the morning train and went straight to Cassidy's house for breakfast. They've been closeted together for 2 hours, and word is the hearing's been moved to this afternoon instead of tomorrow. He's rushing the schedule, Gus observed, trying to get this settled before we can organize our defense properly. Exactly. And there's something else. Buck Henley received word this morning that his debt has been sold to a collection agency out of Denver. They're demanding immediate payment, or they'll seize his livestock and improvements today. Rosalie felt the baby give a particularly strong kick, as if responding to a rising stress. He's moving all his pieces at once, trying to overwhelm us with multiple crises, so we can't respond effectively to any of them. That's Cassidy's style. Dr. Morrison agreed. But sometimes when a man tries to do too much at once, he makes mistakes. And I think he might have made one this time. What kind of mistake? Martha Henley came to see me this morning. She's been thinking about that silver spur, and she remembered something else about the night of the fire. She saw one of the riders clearly enough to recognize him. It was Wade Hutchins, who used to work for Cassidy, but left town suddenly about 2 years ago. Left town, or was encouraged to leave? Gus asked. According to Martha, he was encouraged. Apparently, he'd been drinking too much and talking about things he shouldn't have been talking about. But here's the interesting part. He's back in town as of yesterday, riding with Cassidy's new gunman. Gus was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through the implications. A man with a guilty conscience and a drinking problem. He said finally, "That's the kind of weakness that can be exploited. You think he might be willing to testify?" "I think he might be willing to do a lot of things if the alternative is facing a murder charge. Setting that fire with Samuel inside the house would have been attempted murder, and if anyone died as a result, it could be considered actual murder." Dr. Morrison nodded. And if we can get him to talk, then we might have enough evidence to not just win our case, but to see Cassidy face criminal charges. Gus stood and began gathering his gear. But first, we need to survive the next few hours. As they prepared to ride into town for the hearing, Rosalie carefully tucked Samuel's hidden documents inside her dress, close to her heart. The baby was still restless, and she found herself wondering if children could somehow sense momentous events before they happened. "Whatever happens today," she said to Gus as he helped her onto their borrowed horse, "I want you to know that marrying you was the best decision I ever made. Even if we lose everything?" "We won't lose everything. We'll still have each other. And we'll still have our child. That's more than I had when I stepped off that train 3 weeks ago." Gus mounted his own horse, checking once more that his weapons were secure and ready. "Rosalie, I need you to promise me something. If this goes bad, if shooting starts, you get yourself somewhere safe and stay there. Don't try to be heroic. And what about you?" "I'll do what I have to do to protect what's ours. But I can't do that if I'm worrying about you being in the line of fire." As they rode toward town, they could see smoke rising from multiple chimneys, suggesting that more people than usual were in town for the hearing. Whether they were supporters, opponents, or merely curious spectators remained to be seen. But when they crested the hill that gave them their first clear view of the main street, both of them pulled up short. Cassidy's men were positioned at strategic points throughout the town, one at each end of the street, 2 flanking the courthouse, and 2 more standing near the saloon. They weren't trying to hide their presence. If anything, they seemed to be making a deliberate show of force. "He's turned the whole town into his personal fortress," Rosalie observed. "Maybe, or maybe he's just shown everyone exactly what kind of man he really is." Gus urged his horse forward. "Come on, Mrs. Wilder. Let's go claim what's rightfully ours." As they rode down the main street toward the courthouse, Rosalie could feel the weight of history pressing down on them. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not just their future, but the future of their unborn child. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that this confrontation had been inevitable from the moment she'd first heard Cassidy's name. The baby gave another strong kick, and she pressed her hand to her belly, whispering a silent prayer that they would all survive to see the sunset. The courthouse was a modest 2-story brick building that normally served the county's legal needs with quiet dignity, but today buzzed with an energy that felt dangerous. Townspeople clustered in small groups on the steps and in the street, their conversations hushed but intense. Rosalie could feel their eyes following her and Gus as they made their way toward the entrance, and she wasn't sure whether the attention was sympathetic or hostile. Judge Whitman had set up court in the main assembly room, a space designed for town meetings and social gatherings rather than formal legal proceedings. He was a thin man in his 60s with sharp eyes and a kind of precise manner that suggested a mind comfortable with legal complexities. What troubled Rosalie was how comfortable he seemed in Cassidy's presence. The 2 men had been deep in conversation when she and Gus entered, and the judge's smile had been warm and familiar. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilder," Judge Whitman said as they approached, "I understand you have a claim on the property in question. Mr. Cassidy has been explaining the situation to me." "I'm sure he has," Gus replied evenly. "We're hoping you'll give us the same opportunity." Cassidy stepped forward with his trademark smile. "Of course, Judge. I want this matter resolved fairly and completely. Mrs. Wilder, I trust you've had time to consider my offer?" "We have," Rosalie said, her hand instinctively moving to where Samuel's documents were hidden against her chest. "And we've decided to proceed with our claim, even given the documentation I showed you regarding the previous sale?" "Especially given that documentation." Something flickered in Cassidy's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or calculation. Before he could respond, the courtroom began to fill with spectators. Dr. Morrison entered with Martha and Buck Henley, followed by Mrs. Abernathy. From the boarding house and several other townspeople Rosalie recognized. More surprising was the arrival of Pete Garrison, the old prospector, looking uncomfortable in what were clearly his best clothes, but determined nonetheless. "Quite a turnout," Judge Whitman observed. "Very well, let's proceed. This is an informal hearing to determine the rightful ownership of the property known as the Kemp homestead. Mr. Cassidy, as you've initiated this proceeding, please present your case first. Cassidy's presentation was masterful, calm, logical, and supported by what appeared to be impeccable documentation. He presented the deed transfer signed by Samuel Kemp, along with witness statements and financial records showing the transaction. His manner was that of a reasonable businessman who'd conducted a legitimate purchase and was now being harassed by people making fraudulent claims. Asterisk. The facts are simple, Your Honor, he concluded. I purchased this property legally and in good faith 3 years ago. I have invested considerable resources in its development and improvement. These people arrived with outdated documents and are now attempting to defraud me of my rightful property. Mrs. Wilder, Judge Whitman said, what is your response to these claims? Rosalie rose slowly, very aware of the baby's weight and the way all eyes in the room focused on her. Your Honor, I believe Mr. Cassidy's documents tell only part of the story. With your permission, I'd like to present evidence that will show the true circumstances of that sale. She pulled out Samuel's hidden documents, and the effect on Cassidy was immediate and telling. His composure slipped for just a moment, long enough for everyone in the room to see genuine shock cross his features. Where did you get those? He demanded, his voice sharper than he'd intended. From my carpet bag, where my husband's uncle hid them before his death, Rosalie replied calmly. Your Honor, I present Samuel Kemp's detailed account of the coercion and threats that forced him to sign Mr. Cassidy's deed, along with the subsequent deed transferring the property to my late husband, and an assayer's report detailing the mineral wealth of the land. Judge Whitman accepted the documents and began reading, his expression growing more serious with each page. When he finished, he looked up with troubled eyes. These are very serious allegations, Mrs. Wilder. Mr. Cassidy, how do you respond to the claim that you coerced Mr. Kemp into signing the deed transfer? Preposterous, Cassidy said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. Those documents could have been forged at any time. Samuel Kemp was an old man whose mental faculties were failing. He probably imagined half of what he wrote. Perhaps, Judge Whitman said, but the allegations are specific enough to warrant investigation. The letter mentions witnesses and evidence. Are any of these witnesses available? Dr. Morrison stood up. Your Honor, Mrs. Martha Henley witnessed riders fleeing the Kemp property on the night of the barn fire. Pete Garrison found physical evidence linking Mr. Cassidy to that fire. Both are prepared to testify. I object to this entire proceeding, Cassidy said, rising to his feet. This was supposed to be a simple property dispute, not a criminal trial. These people are making wild accusations, without foundation. The accusations are serious enough to warrant examination, Judge Whitman replied firmly. Mrs. Henley, please step forward. Martha's testimony was clear and damning. She described seeing riders fleeing the burning barn, including one mounted on Cassidy's distinctive paint stallion. Her account was detailed and consistent, and her obvious nervousness actually served to make her more credible. Pete Garrison's testimony about finding the silver spur was equally compelling. When he produced the spur itself, with Cassidy's initials clearly engraved, several people in the courtroom gasped audibly. That spur was stolen from my home, Cassidy protested. This is clearly a conspiracy to defraud me of my legitimate property. When was it stolen? Judge Whitman asked. It must have been. Cassidy's composure was cracking. I don't recall exactly when I noticed it missing. It was then that Gus stood up, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced down armed opponents and lived to tell about it. Your Honor, there's one more witness who might shed light on this situation. Wade Hutchins was one of Mr. Cassidy's employees at the time of the fire, and he's currently in town. The effect of this statement was electric. Cassidy went pale. Several of his gunmen shifted nervously, and a murmur ran through the crowd. But it was Wade Hutchins himself who provided the most dramatic response. He stood up from where he'd been sitting in the back of the room and walked toward the front, his hands shaking and his face ashen. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I've been drinking myself to death for 3 years, trying to forget what we did to that old man. Hutchins, sit down, Cassidy hissed. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, Hutchins replied, his voice growing stronger. We burned Samuel Kemp's barn with orders to make sure he understood what would happen to his house if he didn't sign those papers. When the old man's horse got caught in the fire and died, Kemp nearly had a heart attack right there. That's when he agreed to sign. Judge Whitman leaned forward. Mr. Hutchins, are you saying you participated in arson and coercion? Yes, sir, and I'm saying Elias Cassidy ordered it. Hutchins turned to face his former employer. I'm tired of carrying this guilt, Elias. I'm tired of watching you destroy people for money. The courtroom erupted in shocked voices and angry exclamations. Cassidy's face had gone from pale to flushed red, and his careful composure had completely abandoned him. Your Honor, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. This man is clearly mentally unstable. He's been drinking heavily for years, and his testimony is worthless. That may be, Judge Whitman replied, but combined with the physical evidence and witness testimony, it paints a very clear picture. Mr. Cassidy, I'm prepared to rule that the original deed transfer was obtained through fraud and coercion, making it null and void. It was then that everything went wrong. One of Cassidy's gunmen, a hard-faced man with cold eyes, stepped forward and placed his hand on his weapon. Judge, he said quietly, maybe you ought to reconsider that ruling. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Judge Whitman's face went pale, but his voice remained steady. Are you threatening an officer of the territorial court? I'm suggesting that sometimes justice needs a little guidance, the gunman replied. Gus was on his feet instantly, his hand moving to his Colt with the fluid motion of long practice. Mister, you just made a big mistake. The room held its breath as the two men faced each other across the crowded space. The gunman was younger, probably faster, and certainly more used to this kind of confrontation. But there was something in Gus's bearing, something in the way he stood, and the way his hand rested on his weapon that gave the younger man pause. You sure you want to do this, old man? The gunman asked, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. I'm sure I don't want to, Gus replied calmly. But I'm also sure I will if you don't take your hand away from that gun and sit down. It was Cassidy who broke the standoff, stepping between the two men with his hands raised. Enough, he said. Stand down, Morrison. This isn't the time or place. But even as his gunman reluctantly backed away, Cassidy's eyes found Rosalie, and she saw something there that chilled her to the bone. This wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Judge Whitman, visibly shaken but determined to maintain order, addressed the room. Given the testimony and evidence presented, I'm ruling that the Kemp property rightfully belongs to Mrs. Rosalie Wilder, with clear title dating from Samuel Kemp's original claim. Mr. Cassidy's deed transfer is declared null and void due to fraud and coercion. The courtroom erupted in cheers from some quarters and angry muttering from others. But Rosalie barely heard any of it, because at that moment, a sharp pain shot through her belly, followed by a warm wetness between her legs. Gus, she whispered, gripping his arm. I think the baby's coming. Dr. Morrison was beside them instantly, his medical training overriding everything else. We need to get her somewhere private immediately, he said. This baby isn't waiting. For convenient timing. As Gus helped her toward the door, Rosalie caught sight of Cassidy's face. The mask of civilized respectability had completely fallen away, and what she saw there was pure, murderous rage. Whatever happened next, she knew they had made an enemy who would stop at nothing to destroy them. But for now, all that mattered was getting somewhere safe, before their child decided to enter a world that had suddenly become much more dangerous than either of them had imagined. Dr. Morrison's house sat at the quiet end of Main Street, a modest 2-story building that served as both his residence and medical practice. As Gus carried Rosalie through the front door, she gripped his hand with surprising strength, her face pale but determined. How long between the pains? Dr. Morrison asked, leading them to his examination room. They started about 10 minutes ago, Rosalie gasped as another contraction hit. But they're getting stronger fast. First babies usually take their time, the doctor said, helping her onto the examination table. But this little one seems to have its own schedule. He looked at Gus seriously. I need you to stand guard. If Cassidy's as angry as he looked in that courtroom, he might try something desperate. Gus checked his Colt and moved to the window that overlooked the street. Doc, you just focus on Rosalie and the baby. I'll handle anything else that comes. Up. What came up arrived within the hour. Gus spotted them first 6 riders approaching the house at a deliberate pace that spoke of men with a plan. Cassidy led them, no longer bothering with his mask of respectability. Even at a distance, Gus could see the fury in his posture. The way he sat his horse like a man who'd decided that civilization was a luxury he could no longer afford. Doc, Gus called quietly, not wanting to alarm Rosalie. We've got company. Doctor. Morrison appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a towel. How many? 6, Cassidy and his hired guns. From the examination room came Rosalie's voice, strained but steady. Don't you dare let them hurt my baby. The rider stopped in front of the house, and Cassidy's voice carried clearly through the evening air. Wilder, come out here. We need to talk. Gus opened the front door, but stayed in the doorway, his hand resting on his gun butt. I'm listening. The judge may have been fooled by your theatrics, but this isn't over. That land belongs to me, and I mean to have it. Judge ruled pretty clear on that, Gus replied. Land belongs to my wife, legal and proper. Legal? Cassidy's laugh was bitter. You think hiding behind technicalities will save you? I've put too much time and money into acquiring that property to let some broken-down cowboy and his pregnant whore take it from me. The insult to Rosalie hit Gus like a physical blow, and he felt the old rage building in his chest, the cold, focused anger that had once made him legendary. Mister, he said, his voice dropping to the deadly quiet tone that had worn smarter. Men to back down. You just crossed a line you can't uncross. Did I? Cassidy signaled to his men, who began spreading out to surround the house. Here's what's going to happen, Wilder. You're going to sign a paper transferring that land claim to me. In return, I'll let you and your wife leave town alive. And if I don't, Ben will take the land anyway, and the good doctor here will have 2 more patients than he can handle. From inside the house came a cry of pain that made Gus's heart clench. Rosalie was fighting to bring their child into the world, and he'd be damned if he'd let these bastards threaten that miracle. Doc, he called without taking his eyes off Cassidy. How much time do you need? An hour, maybe 2. The baby's not waiting, but it's not rushing either. Gus stepped fully outside, closing the door behind him. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, painting the sky the color of blood and casting long shadows across the street. It seemed fitting somehow a confrontation that had been building for weeks was finally coming to its inevitable conclusion. You boys sure you want to do this? He asked, loud enough for all of Cassidy's men to hear. I'm an old man. That's true enough. But I'm also Hell's Wind, and some of you might have heard stories about what that name used to mean. One of the gunmen shifted nervously in his saddle. Thought Hell's Wind was dead. Rumors of my death, Gus said with a cold smile, have been greatly exaggerated. It was then that the unexpected happened. Buck Henley appeared at the corner of the street, carrying a rifle and looking grim. Behind him came Pete Garrison, also armed, and behind them came more townspeople, Mrs. Abernathy with a shotgun, the blacksmith with a hammer that looked capable of cracking skulls, even young Tommy Fletcher, who worked at the general store, carrying what appeared to be his father's old army revolver. Afternoon, Gus, Buck called out. Thought you might could use some help. Cassidy's face darkened as he realized the odds had suddenly shifted. This doesn't concern any of you people. Like hell it doesn't, Mrs. Abernathy snapped. We're tired of you running roughshod over decent folks. Time someone stood up to you. The standoff stretched taut as a fiddle string, with armed men on, both sides trying to calculate odds and advantages. It was Cassidy who broke first, pulling a pistol from his coat and aiming it directly at the door of Dr. Morrison's house. Maybe I can't get to you, Wilder, but I can sure as hell get to them. One shot through that door, and your precious wife and baby, He never finished the sentence. Gus's Colt cleared leather with the smooth, practiced motion of 40 years of gunfighting, and his shot took Cassidy in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle and sending his own pistol flying into the dust. "Anyone else want to threaten my family?" Gus asked, his weapon now trained on the remaining gunmen. The answer came in the form of gunfire as Cassidy's men went for their weapons. But they'd made a crucial miscalculation. They were facing not just one aging gunfighter, but an entire community that had decided they'd had enough of being bullied. The street erupted in smoke and flame as the two sides exchanged fire. Gus dove behind a water trough, feeling splinters fly as bullets chewed into the wood around him. From his covered position, he could see Buck Henley crouched behind a fence post, calmly working the lever of his rifle, while Pete Garrison had taken position behind a wagon and was proving that years of hunting had made him a competent marksman. One of Cassidy's gunmen went down with a cry, clutching his leg. Another threw down his weapon and raised his hands, clearly having decided that the money wasn't worth dying for. But the real surprise came from an unexpected quarter. Dr. Morrison appeared in an upstairs window of his house, holding what appeared to be a military rifle, and his first shot took one of the remaining gunmen clean out of his saddle. "Anybody else want to threaten my patients?" The doctor called down, working the bolt action with practiced efficiency. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun. Of Cassidy's 6 men, 1 was dead, 2 were wounded, 2 had surrendered, and 1 had fled town at a dead gallop. Cassidy himself lay in the dust, clutching his wounded shoulder and cursing with the creative vocabulary of a man who'd spent his life getting his way through intimidation and violence. As the gun smoke cleared, Gus became aware of a sound that made his heart leap, the unmistakable cry of a newborn baby coming from inside Dr. Morrison's house. "Well, I'll be damned," Buck Henley said, grinning broadly. "Sounds like all this excitement was just a birth announcement." Gus holstered his weapon and started toward the house, but stopped when he saw Cassidy struggling to sit up, his face twisted with rage and pain. "This isn't over, Wilder," Cassidy snarled. "I've got lawyers, connections, money. I'll destroy you in the courts if I can't do it with guns." Gus looked down at the bleeding man with something that might have been pity. "Mister, you just threatened my wife and child in front of half the town. You brought guns to a legal dispute and tried to settle it with violence. Any lawyer worth his salt will tell you that you've got about as much chance in court now as a snowball in hell." As if to emphasize his point, Judge Whitman appeared from where he'd taken cover during the shooting, looking shaken but determined. "Mr. Cassidy," he said formally, "based on what I've witnessed here today, I'm issuing a warrant for your arrest on charges of attempted murder, conspiracy, and threatening an officer of the court. Sheriff or no sheriff, this territory has laws, and you've broken most of them." But none of that mattered to Gus anymore. From inside the house came the sound of his child crying, and Rosalie calling his name. The fight was over, the land was theirs, and somewhere upstairs, the most important thing in his life was waiting to meet him. Gus took the stairs 2 at a time, his heart pounding with an entirely different kind of adrenaline than what had carried him through the gunfight. At the top of the landing, Dr. Morrison appeared, his sleeves rolled up, and his face bearing the exhausted satisfaction of a man who'd successfully delivered new life into the world. "Congratulations," the doctor said, gripping Gus's shoulder. "You have a daughter, a beautiful, healthy daughter." The examination room had been transformed. Clean linens covered the bed where Rosalie lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with perspiration, but her face radiant with joy and exhaustion. And there, nestled in her arms, was the most perfect thing Gus had ever seen, a tiny, red-faced bundle wrapped in soft white cloth, her small fist waving in the air as if she were already ready to take on the world. "Hello, Papa," Rosalie whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Come meet your daughter." Gus approached the bed with the same careful reverence he might have shown entering a church. When Rosalie placed the baby in his arms, he felt something shift inside his chest, something fundamental and permanent. This small person, barely an hour old, had already changed everything about who he was and what mattered to him. "She's beautiful," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Perfect. She arrived right when that first shot was fired, Dr. Morrison said, cleaning his instruments. Almost like she wanted to be born into a world where her parents had already fought for her future. The baby opened her eyes then, and Gus found himself looking into the darkest, most intelligent gaze he'd ever encountered. She seemed to study his weathered face with serious attention, as if trying to memorize every line and scar. "What should we call her?" Rosalie asked. Gus considered for a moment, thinking about everything that had brought them to this moment. Desperate meeting at the railway station, the struggle for the land, the community that had rallied to support them. "Hope," he said finally. "Her name is Hope." From outside came the sound of voices and activity as the townspeople dealt with the aftermath of the gunfight. But inside the quiet room, the three of them existed in their own perfect bubble of peace and new beginning. "Gus," Rosalie said softly, "is it really over? The fighting's over. Cassidy's finished. He's got no more cards to play." Gus settled into the chair beside the bed, reluctant to put down his daughter even for a moment. The land's ours, legal and clear. The mineral rights. 2. We've got everything we need to build a good life. Dr. Morrison nodded. Cassidy's reputation is destroyed. No one in the territory will do business with a man who brought guns to a courtroom and threatened a woman in childbirth. And with Wade Hutchins's testimony on record, he'll be lucky if he avoids prison. Asterisk, as if summoned by their conversation. Buck Henley appeared in the doorway, hat in hand and a grin on his face. "Sorry to intrude, but I wanted to thank you folks. With Cassidy out of the picture, his debt collectors have suddenly decided my payments are current after all. Funny how that works. What will you do now?" Rosalie asked. "Well, I was hoping to talk to you about that. The judge says since Cassidy's claim was fraudulent, all his improvements to the property revert to you. That includes the livestock I've been tending. But I was thinking if you're planning to work that land, you might could use a partner. Someone who knows the country and the cattle business." Gus looked at Rosalie, and she nodded slightly. "Sounds like it might work out well for everybody," Gus said. "A man my age could use help with the heavy work, and you've already proved you know how to handle the land. There's one more thing," Buck said, his expression growing serious. "Martha wanted me to tell you. We'd be honored to stand as godparents to your little girl, if you're agreeable. We figure she's going to need all the family she can get in this rough country." The offer touched Rosalie so deeply that fresh tears began flowing. "We'd be honored." As evening settled over the town, a steady stream of visitors came to pay their respects and welcome the newest member of their community. Mrs. Abernathy brought a basket of food and offered to help with cooking and cleaning. Pete Garrison presented them with a small nugget of silver he'd found in the creek for the baby's first Christmas. Even Judge Whitman stopped by to congratulate them and to inform them that he'd filed all the necessary papers to ensure their land title was absolutely secure. "You know," the judge said as he prepared to leave, "this case will probably become famous in territorial law. The way a community stood up to corruption, the way justice prevailed despite intimidation." He smiled. "It's the kind of story that gives a man faith in the future of this territory." When they were finally alone again, Gus helped Rosalie and the baby into the wagon Dr. Morrison had lent them for the journey back to their land. As they drove through the gathering darkness toward their homestead, Gus found himself thinking about how much had changed since that first desperate night when Rosalie had proposed marriage to a stranger on a railway platform. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked as they rolled along the familiar road. "Marrying you? Coming here? Fighting for what's ours?" Rosalie adjusted the baby in her arms, making sure she was warm against the cool evening air. "Not for a second. This is where we belong, Gus. This is where hope belongs." When they reached the homestead, they found something that made them both smile. Someone, probably Buck and Martha, had been busy. The house was clean and ready for occupancy, with a fire burning in the fireplace and food waiting on the table. Fresh flowers filled a jar on the windowsill, and the cradle Dr. Morrison had given them sat ready beside the bed dot as Gus carried his wife and daughter across the threshold of their home. Hope began to fuss slightly, making the small sounds that new babies make when they're exploring their voices. But when they entered the warm, welcoming house, she settled immediately, as if she too understood that this was where she belonged. "Welcome home, Mrs. Wilder," Gus said, settling Rosalie in a comfortable chair by the fireplace. "Welcome home, Mr. Wilder," she replied, and in her voice was all the love and contentment that had grown from their unlikely beginning. Outside, the night sounds of their valley settled around them. The distant lowing of cattle, the soft murmur of the creek, the gentle sigh of wind through the trees. It was the sound of peace, of home, of a future that stretched out before them full of possibility and hope. As Gus banked the fire for the night and checked the doors and windows, he found himself thinking about the silver spurs he'd worn for so many years. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd put them away for good. Hell's Wind was finally at rest, and Augustus Wilder, husband, father, and homesteader, was ready to begin the most important chapter of his life. When he returned to the main room, he found Rosalie nursing their daughter, both of them peaceful and content in the flickering firelight. The baby's eyes were closed now, her small hand wrapped around Rosalie's finger with the instinctive grip of new life, claiming its place in the world. "She's perfect," Rosalie whispered, looking up at him with eyes that held all the love in the world. "She is," Gus agreed, settling beside them. "And so is this moment. So is our life." As the three of them sat together in the warm glow of their first evening as a complete family, hope, both the baby and the emotion, filled every corner of their home and every beat of their hearts. 6 months after that violent evening when Hope entered the world, the Wilder homestead had transformed into something that would have amazed anyone who remembered its condition. The previous autumn, the house had been expanded with a proper nursery and a larger kitchen. The barn had been rebuilt and filled with healthy livestock, and the fields showed the green promise of the spring planting that would soon provide their first real harvest. Gus sat in the rocking chair he'd built during the long winter evenings, watching Rosalie tend to their garden while Hope napped peacefully in the cradle beside him. The chair was solid oak, built to last generations, with careful joinery that spoke of patience and love rather than hurried necessity. Every evening he would sit in this chair with his daughter in his arms, telling her stories about the changing seasons, the growing crops, and the bright future that stretched ahead of them. The morning mail had brought news that filled them both with quiet satisfaction. Elias Cassidy had been sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison for fraud, coercion, and attempted murder. Wade Hutchins, in exchange for his testimony, had received a suspended sentence and had left the territory to start fresh somewhere far from the scenes of his crimes. A silver mine that Gus and Buck had opened the previous month was already producing enough wealth to ensure that Hope would never know the kind of desperate poverty that had driven her parents together. "She's getting so big," Rosalie said, settling into the chair beside him, with dirt still under her fingernails from the garden work. At 7 months old, Hope was beginning to show signs of the determined personality that seemed to run in both sides of her unlikely family tree. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and when she laughed, which she did often, the sound filled their home with pure joy. "Doc Morrison says she's ahead of schedule for everything," Gus replied, gently rocking the cradle with his foot. "Sitting up, trying to crawl, babbling like she's got important things to say. She gets that from you. Always has to have the last word." Gus chuckled. "I seem to recall a certain young woman who proposed marriage to a complete stranger because she'd decided it was the sensible thing to do. I'd say our daughter comes by her determination honestly." From the direction of the barn came the sound of Buck Henley calling to his children, who'd become frequent visitors to the Wilder homestead. The partnership between the two families had flourished, with Buck handling most of the livestock and heavy farming while Gus managed the mining operation and the business affairs. Martha had become Rosalie's closest friend, and their children treated Hope like a beloved little sister. "I've been thinking," Rosalie said, picking up her mending from the basket beside her chair, "about what we'll tell Hope when she's old enough to understand how we met." "What about it?" "Well, it's not exactly a conventional love story, is it? Her parents met on a railway platform and married the same day out of desperation." Gus considered this as he watched his daughter sleep. Hope had one tiny fist curled near her face, and her breathing was the soft, peaceful rhythm of perfect contentment. "I think," he said finally, "that we'll tell her the truth. That sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. That courage isn't just about facing down gunfighters. Sometimes it's about taking a chance on kindness from a stranger. That love doesn't always start with a lightning bolt. Sometimes it grows slowly, day by day, until one morning you wake up and realize you can't imagine your life without the person lying beside you. And that families aren't just about blood," Rosalie added, "but about people who choose to take care of each other no matter what." Dr. Morrison appeared on the path leading to their house, making his weekly visit to check on Hope's progress. At 71 years old, he'd become an honorary grandfather to their daughter, and his genuine delight in her development was one of the sweetest aspects of their new life. "How's our little princess today?" he asked, settling into the third chair that had become permanently stationed on their front porch. "Growing faster than weeds after rain," Gus replied, "and twice as determined." Dr. Morrison examined Hope with a gentle competence that had made him beloved throughout the county. "Perfect health," he pronounced. "Strong as a little ox and smart as a whip. You two should be proud." "We are," Rosalie said softly, "every single day." As the doctor prepared to leave, he pulled a newspaper from his saddlebag. "Thought you might be interested in this," he said, pointing to an article on the front page. "The territorial governor is using your case as an example of how law and order are taking hold in Colorado. Says the way this community stood up to corruption proves that the frontier is ready for statehood." Gus read the article with growing amazement. The story portrayed them as heroes, pioneers who'd helped establish the rule of law in wild country. It was strange to see their desperate struggle transformed into legend, their fear and determination turned into symbols of frontier courage. "Fame's a funny thing," he said, folding the newspaper carefully. "Makes everything seem more noble and purposeful than it felt at the time." "Maybe," Dr. Morrison replied. "Or maybe what you two did really was noble and purposeful, and you just couldn't see it because you were living it instead of reading about it." That evening, as they sat down to dinner with Buck's family, a tradition that had developed over the winter months, Martha raised her glass of cider in a toast. "To the Wilders," she said, "for showing us that sometimes the best families are the ones that choose each other." "To good friends and new beginnings," Rosalie replied, lifting her own glass. "To Hope," Gus added, "and to the future she represents." As the adults drank their toast, Hope babbled happily from her high chair, waving her spoon and scattering bits of food with the enthusiasm of someone who found the world endlessly fascinating. When she caught sight of Gus watching her, she gave him the brilliant smile that never failed to make his heart swell with pride and love. Later, after their guests had gone home and Hope was sleeping peacefully in her nursery, Gus and Rosalie sat on their front porch, watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky. The valley spread below them, peaceful and prosperous, with the lights of other homesteads twinkling like earthbound stars. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we hadn't met that day?" Rosalie asked, her hand resting in his. "I try not to," Gus replied honestly. "I figure I was probably dying by inches before you came along, just too stubborn to lie down and admit it. And I was drowning in despair and calling it practicality. Instead, we saved each other and created something beautiful in the process." A shooting star streaked across the sky above them, and Rosalie made a silent wish for their daughter's future, that Hope would grow up in a world where courage and kindness mattered more than money and power, where people looked out for each other, where love could grow from the most unlikely beginnings. As if sensing her mother's thoughts, Hope stirred in her sleep, making the small contented sounds that meant she was dreaming peacefully. Through the open window, they could hear her gentle breathing, the sound of new life taking root in soil that had been watered with struggle and determination. "Thank you," Rosalie whispered, though whether she was speaking to Gus, to fate, or to the vast starry sky above them, she couldn't have said. "Thank you," Gus replied, understanding perfectly. They sat in comfortable silence as the night settled around them. Two people who'd found each other in desperation and built something lasting from hope and hard work. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There were always challenges on the frontier, But tonight was perfect in its simple peace. In the distance, a train whistle sounded as the evening freight passed through Jubilee Gap, carrying other travelers toward uncertain destinies. But Gus and Rosalie barely heard it. They'd already completed their most important journey, the one that had taken them from strangers to lovers to parents, from desperation to hope, from a chance meeting on a railway platform to a love that would last all their days. And in her nursery, Hope slept on, dreaming the dreams of a child who'd been born into love and would grow up surrounded by the kind of family that was built not just on blood, but on choice, commitment, and the daily miracle of people deciding to take care of each other no matter what storms might come.